The date of September 2nd, 1945, marked the end of the Second World War. German troops had been destroyed by Soviets from the east and U.S. troops from the west. The final days brought the armies into Berlin for one final siege upon German troops. On April 30th, 1945, the Nazi Führer Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker along with his wife, Eva, thus ending the Nazi Reich, which eventually helped lead to the conclusion of World War II. Despite the conclusion of the war, there were two standing powers that had the ability to change the world. These two world powers were the Soviet Union and the United States of America. These two powers would propel the world into facing a critical conflict: how to avoid nuclear war. Throughout many years, the two countries involved themselves in competitions against one another to show the world who was better. Several of these competitions ended up being the proudest moments in U.S. and USSR history. The most popular, peaceful challenge that the countries undertook was known to the world as the space race. The race began when the U.S. made announcements that they will be looking for the stars and exploring the great unknown. The Soviets sent the first satellite into space, along with sending the first man and dog into space. However, the U.S. won the race by sending the first man to the moon and bringing him back. This only furthered the tension between the two rival countries. When Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, the United States was not a supporter of his political ideology. The Americans were cautious of Castro when he befriended Soviet Union leader Nikita Khrushchev and announced his plan to form a communist government. In an interview of Fidel Castro, he reportedly said, "I am not a communist. The United States made me one." Hostile tensions were formed between Castro and the United States when the U.S. supposedly inserted a lethal bacteria in his cigars in an attempt to end his life, putting an end to the communist government. When the U.S. already circumspect of Fidel Castro's leadership style, they decided to form Operation Mongoose. This was a plan to invade Cuba with the trained Cuban exiles and overthrow the government, and finally assassinate Fidel Castro. When information of the invasion was leaked, Cuba asked the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics for help. The Soviet Union agreed to install missiles to help defend Cuba. The swamp-like conditions, along with Cuban preparations for the attack, led to the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion made John F. Kennedy seem like a weak government official and made citizens of the U.S. doubt the capability of their president. Meanwhile, in Cuba, after the successful dissolution of the invasion, strong ties were made with the Soviet Union and put additional strain on the U.S. and Cuba. The tensions continued to rise on October 14, 1962, when an American spy plane flew over Cuba, taking photographs of missile sites. According to U.S. military experts, these were nuclear missile sites being built by the USSR. 2 days later, on October 16, 1962, United States President John F. Kennedy was informed that in 10 days these missiles would be completely operational. Seeking guidance, he called together the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. This committee then decided that the presence of these missiles was not acceptable. However, they faced the challenge of avoiding a nuclear war if the conflict was not approached cautiously. Some of the suggested approaches were either do nothing, a surgical air attack, an air and sea invasion, a blockade, or a diplomatic pressure. With this list in mind, time was of the essence. Following the ex-con meeting, President Kennedy met with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko. Kennedy stated that the missiles in Cuba would not be tolerated. In a direct quote, he said, "You would agree to remove these weapon systems from Cuba under appropriate United Nations observations and supervision, and undertake with suitable safeguard to halt the further introduction of such weapon systems into Cuba." However, Soviet leaders deny that there were any missiles in Cuba. After the dissatisfying meeting with Gromyko on October 22, 1962, Kennedy finally made his decision. A military blockade was to be placed on Cuba. He then decided to announce the situation to the public, and he called for the Soviet removal of the missiles. In a speech written by Kennedy regarding the missiles, he states, "Nuclear weapons are so destructive and ballistic missiles are so swift that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace." On October 23, 1962, Premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, responded to Kennedy's announcements in a letter saying that the Soviet Union will not acknowledge the blockade and repeats that there are no nuclear missiles in Cuba. An excerpt from this letter reads, "You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather issuing an ultimatum, and you are threatening that if we do not obey your orders, you will then use force. No, Mr. President, I cannot agree with this, and I think that deep inside you will admit that I am right. I am convinced that if you were in my place, you would do the same." On October 24th, the United States enforced the blockade. The tensions dramatically rose as a Soviet Union ship that is boarded with missiles approached the 500-mile blockade zone. At precisely 10:32 a.m., the 20 ships that were nearest to the blockade zone suddenly stopped and retreated. The United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk stated, "It was eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked." Despite the Soviet Union's retreat on October 25th, aerial shots of Cuba showed a rapid increase of missile bases. Hard photographic evidence was taken of a Russian deployment of MRBMs and IRBMs in Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev had often said his goal was for the United States and the Soviet Union to create a peaceful coexistence. With this goal in mind, on October 28th, Khrushchev declares he will dismantle all missiles in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union. In return, Kennedy ordered for nuclear missiles surrounding Soviet Union to be dismantled at once. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a perfect example of conflict and compromise, because without the US and Soviet Union's ability to communicate effectively, the world could have been faced with a nuclear war. Although both sides made declarations that they did not want to face a nuclear war, they both were willing to do whatever it took to protect their country. However, due to compromise, this devastating consequence was avoided and saved the lives of millions. As said by John F. Kennedy, "Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom. Here in this hemisphere, and, we hope, around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved."